Seattle, fall 1992. The air smelled of wet leaves and the faint aroma of coffee from a nearby kiosk. In the park by Lake Washington, everything breathed peace. The yellow-red maples reflected in the still surface of the water, the rare passers-by with books and dogs, the rustle of leaves that reminded me of the whisper of memory. On the far bench, almost in the shade of a birch tree, sat a man in a gray tweed coat. His name was Frank Davenport. He was 47, but there was weariness in his posture and a tense detachment in his gaze. He seemed to be looking not at the lake, but through it, where the past breathed behind the glass of consciousness. A ring glittered on his left hand, carelessly, as if it were a casual accessory, but a closer look made it clear that it was more than just jewelry. A thin bezel of white gold, with a blue sapphire in the center, shining even through the cloudy day. He turned it slowly on his finger as if tuning it to some inner wave. The gesture was unconscious but constant, the way people cling to the remnants of control in a life long out of control. Frank didn't like days like this. Fall always reminded him of things that were too important to forget and too painful to remember. Despite his business successes, high-end real estate, and influential connections, there was a gaping void in his life. He couldn't call it loneliness, rather, it was the absence of something elusive. It was as if a piece of the puzzle, lost as a child, had suddenly become vital to an adult. A child's laughter broke through this state like a crack in glass. A boy of about 8 years old stopped on the path in front of the bench. In his hands was a kite tangled in the sleeve of his jacket. He looked up, lingered on the ring, and without thinking, stepped closer. His hair was the color of honey and his eyes were a greenish-brown, too attentive for his age. He leaned toward Frank as if he were studying a display case of rarities. "You have a ring like my grandfather's in an old photograph," he said with such delight as if he had seen a trick. Frank lowered his gaze and froze in surprise. Something in the boy's voice, in the way he spoke, was familiar. He wanted to ask something, but at that moment quick footsteps were heard, and a woman appeared from around the corner. She was dressed in a coat the color of red wine, her hair was gathered in a careless bundle, her face was tired, but beautiful in that quiet, aged manner that one does not notice at once, but remembers later. She came closer, apologized for her son, and took his hand. The boy wanted to object, but when he saw his mother tense up, he was silent. Frank was about to politely say goodbye when his gaze slid to her neck. A silver cord glinted under the thin scarf, and at the end of it was a ring. The same. A sapphire, a dark bezel with the same pattern, as if it had soaked up the sunset. They both noticed it at the same moment. The woman took it with her hand as if she wanted to hide it, but it was too late. Their gazes met, and something more than surprise flashed in them. Recognition. It was as if Frank froze and a voice, long forgotten, came into his head, the voice of his grandmother, Margaret. She used to say, "When the rings meet, the real thing begins." He had laughed then, calling it poetic nonsense. But now his palms were sweating, his breath hitched, and every muscle tensed as if he were facing something irreversible. The woman introduced herself discreetly, Hannah Bennett. Mentioned that her son was Lucas, and that they were just taking a walk after school. Her voice was shaky, though she was clearly trying to sound collected. Frank gave a barely perceptible nod. He didn't ask a single question, didn't utter a single guess. But something inside him was already screaming. They left quickly. Lucas looked back and waved, but Hannah didn't turn around. Frank remained sitting on the same bench, but inside everything had already changed. The fall wind picked up the leaves and spiraled up like a foreboding whirlwind. He looked at the ring again. It no longer seemed like a mere jewel. It was a door. And it looked like someone had just knocked. Frank Davenport's house towered over a quiet street in the upscale Madison Park neighborhood, surrounded by tall maples and immaculately trimmed lawns. From the outside, it seemed like a fortress, gray stone, stained glass windows, metal gates with automatic drive. Inside, everything was imbued with control and rationality, strict lines, glass, cold surfaces. But on the second floor, behind a heavy oak door, there was an office he hardly ever visited. It smelled of cedar, dust, and something else, the past. He switched on a soft table lamp, and in the dim light the room came alive. Shelves of books, a globe in the corner, a chair upholstered in dark green leather, and by the window an antique chest of drawers with bronze handles. In the bottom drawer, behind stacks of old newspapers and forgotten papers, was a small mahogany box. He recognized it at once. Margaret, his grandmother, kept in it what she called letters not for everyone. She had once mentioned that everything that was not for business discussion was in there. Frank set the box on the table, touched the lid. His hands trembled a little. He opened it slowly, as if he was afraid that with the first breath of the aroma of old wood something alive and forgotten would come out. Inside were dense, neatly folded stacks of letters, photographs, notes. Everything smelled of her: lavender, tobacco smoke, and old paper. He pulled out the top photograph. It showed Margaret, aged about 25, at a summer ball. Light dress, dazzling smile, bright eyes. Next to her is a man in the shadows. His face was deliberately cut off as if someone wanted to erase it from memory. But the hand resting on Margaret's waist was male, strong, with a ring just like the one Frank had on his arm. He turned the photo over. On the back, in his grandmother's neat handwriting, June 1955. That's where it all began. Beneath the photos lay a diary. A dark blue cover worn with the marks of dozens of touches. On the inside cover were the initials MD, and a short inscription in pencil: if someone found it, it was time. Frank sat down at his desk and opened at random. June 13, 1955. I met him again. Raymond. A man you can't turn away from. He knows who I am, but with him I don't feel like Davenport, but just Margaret. Today he gave me a ring. We exchanged like children, as if it were an engagement ring. I know my father would never let us be together. But he promised, if one day the rings meet again, everything will change. The name stuck in his memory: Raymond. He couldn't remember anyone by that name in his family, but the feeling that the name had been heard before kept him going. He flipped on, and each page became more and more revealing, full of hope but also hopelessness. The last entry was dated October 1955. In it, Margaret wrote about saying goodbye, about Raymond leaving suddenly without explaining anything. I hid his letters. Didn't open them. I couldn't. But I kept the ring. It's my anchor. Frank closed the journal. Everything inside was turning upside down. He felt he was at the edge of something huge. Instinct, the same instinct that helped him read people in meeting rooms, told him this wasn't just a story of unhappy love. There was something more here. He reached for the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Miles Gray was not only his security consultant, but a private investigator with access to sources even the press didn't know about. Frank briefly described who he was looking for: a woman named Hannah Bennett, mother of a boy named Lucas, probably around 35 years old, possibly working in the arts or education. He asked to check papers, family ties, birth certificate. The answer came in the evening. Miles' voice was calm, but there was tension in it. I checked. Bennett is the maiden name. Hannah was born in 1958 in Portland, but the birth certificate says father is Raymond Bennett. There's no photo. The document looks authentic, but the entry is not duplicated in other databases. Frank stared out the darkening office window. Seattle was blanketed with evening rain, the streets glittering like glass. The name Raymond came up again. And now it was not only in his grandmother's diary, but in the life of the woman who wore an identical ring around her neck. Everything was beginning to come together in a disturbing mosaic, and he knew there was no turning back. The old Lighthouse Cafe stood on the edge of a coastal village, an hour and a half from Seattle, where the Puget Sound meets the cold Pacific Ocean. The small establishment, with its peeling sign and stained glass windows that glinted in the amber gold light of the setting sun, seemed ripped from another time. There weren't many customers here: local fishermen, a couple of elderly couples, a waitress with a perpetual pencil behind her ear. This was where Frank had invited Hannah, hoping the noise of the big city wouldn't interfere with a conversation that had long demanded candor. He sat at the window facing the ocean, watching the waves crash against the rocks below and the silhouette of the old lighthouse sway slightly in the rippling air. The cafe was drenched in the scent of cinnamon and warmed milk, but in his head there was a very different smell: lavender and dusty paper. He'd brought with him the very picture of Margaret, his grandmother, smiling with the face of the man next to her deliberately cut off. It was the one he was going to start with. Hannah entered quietly, exactly at the appointed time. She wore a simple navy blue coat, her hair loose, her eyes wary. She sat down opposite, not pretending that she had come out of politeness. She came because she felt it too. The rings couldn't have matched by accident. Frank didn't hesitate. He pulled out the photo, placed it on the table, and nodded discreetly in her direction. Hannah looked at it, and her hand involuntarily covered her mouth. Her fingers trembled. "It's him," she breathed out, not taking her gaze away. "My grandfather, Raymond Bennett. We had almost the same picture at home, only without it, just him with a ring on his hand. I didn't know who was next to him, now I do." The silence between them lingered, but there was no awkwardness in it, more like a thick fabric filled with conjecture. Frank carefully removed the ring from his finger and placed it on the table. Hannah took hers from her neck, where it always hung under her clothes, and placed it beside her. It was absolutely identical. The same pattern, the same shape of the setting, even the tiny chip on the inside. It was as if they'd been made at the same time with the same intention. Hannah looked at the rings, then at Frank. "Before he died, my grandfather told me," her voice was quiet but sure, "that this ring was more than just a memory. He said, it's part of a story you'll finish someday. Find the garden in the morning sun, the answers are there." I thought he was delusional then. But now? Frank nodded. He remembered his grandmother whispering when she could hardly speak anymore, "When the rings meet, the real thing will begin." They had both grown up with phrases that had seemed like poetic fictions of the elderly then, but now suddenly formed into a single living pattern. He told Hannah about Margaret's diary. The entries about Raymond, about their brief, passionate, doomed love, about how she had kept the ring for herself and given the other to him. About how she had written, "If the rings come together again, then all is not yet lost." Hannah listened in silence, holding onto her coffee cup like an anchor. When he fell silent, she began her story. Raymond Bennett, her grandfather, wasn't just an engineer, as the official forms said. He had actually worked undercover as a federal investigator in the post-war years. He handled complex cases involving money laundering and corruption at the top. And one day in the mid-50s he got on the trail of the Davenport family. That's how he met Margaret. According to her, he was supposed to expose serious schemes involving many respected names. But when he met Margaret, everything changed. He fell in love. At first he thought he could reconcile love and duty. Then he realized it was incompatible. But he didn't leave of his own accord. He was recalled. Under duress. Threatened her. The day he left a letter and a ring. She probably never read it. And he never got another line from her. Frank listened and felt a heavy but necessary flower of understanding blossom in his chest. Their ancestors weren't just part of a dramatic love story, they were victims of the system, circumstances, and other people's decisions. He looked out the window at the old lighthouse, and suddenly the phrase about the garden in the morning sun sounded like an instruction. Grandmother had said that the garden at the mansion was her only free place. And every morning she started there. Perhaps that's where the trail leads. Where the dawn leaves fewer shadows. Hannah looked up. "We must find this garden," she said quietly. Frank nodded silently. Because he knew, from this moment on, they were no longer just heirs. They are the continuators of an unfinished story. The Davenport estate, perched on a hill near Lake Sammamish, held within it what no glass walls in Seattle's office skyscrapers could: the past. Where once dinner parties and morning teas had been held on the terrace, everything was now covered with the patina of time. The peeling paint on the banisters, the thudding echo of footsteps on the marble floor, and the musty odor in the hallways that no aroma stick could mask. But this house had something that no modern mansion had: a greenhouse surrounded by glass with ornate bars, like the glass heart of the whole building. It was there, according to Margaret's diary entries, that Frank and Hannah had gone. The greenhouse appeared almost untouched. Dull sunlight shone through the dust on the glass walls, painting patterns on the mosaic tile floor. Old clay pots with withered stems stood along the walls, and in the center, on a slightly askew table, lay yellowed sheet music. Frank recognized the tune at once: Moonlight Sonata. His grandmother played it every time she wanted to be alone. He remembered sitting under the table for long periods of time as a child, listening to the sounds of the piano filling the room with a sense of sad tranquility. He walked over to the old piano that still stood against the far wall. The same sheet music was under the lid, but when he looked closer, he realized that it wasn't just a sheet of music. Tucked between the sheet music were miniature symbols, numbers, coordinates, arrows, and even a small diagram of the first floor plan of the house. Hannah, glancing at them aghast. It was a map. Margaret had used the music as a cipher, hidden the map in plain sight, certain that only someone who knew her truly would know where to look. Following the directions, they crossed the greenhouse and stopped in front of what appeared to be a blank wall. But down below, behind the mosaic tiles, Frank fumbled for a tiny ledge. Pressing lightly, he heard a click. The wall shook and slowly opened, revealing a narrow passage downward. The smell of damp and old paper hit his nose. As they descended the stone spiral staircase, they felt time shrinking, as if preparing to shoot the truth right in their faces. Downstairs turned out to be a room the size of a pantry. On the walls were photographs, newspaper clippings, and diagrams connected by red threads, like in an investigative office. On the desk were stacks of documents marked confidential, letters addressed to unknown persons, drafts of reports. Everything Margaret and Raymond collected. Art smuggling, financial fraud, high-profile involvement. Some of the names were painfully familiar to Frank, board members, business partners, even politicians who'd appeared on magazine covers. But no sooner had they explored it all than footsteps sounded. Muffled, confident, coming from above. They turned around and a few seconds later a man appeared in the doorway. Miles Gray. His face was tense, his eyes cold. In his hand was a silenced pistol. He walked in as if he were walking into his home. His voice sounded calm, almost bored. So you found it after all. Too bad. It should have stayed buried with your grandmother. Hannah retreated back against the wall, Frank shading her with himself. Miles continued, you have no idea how many people I eliminated to keep all of this from coming out. Including your father, Frank. The man's mind went blank. My father's death on the boat 15 years ago. They said it was an accident then. He clenched his fists. Hannah slumped against the closet, trying to fumble for something heavy, useless. Miles raised his gun. A shot rang out. But not from Miles. He shuddered, swayed, and sank to his knees. From behind him came an old man with a cane. Henry Davenport. His hand was trembling, the gun was old, military. I knew you'd betray one day, Gray. I just didn't know how far you'd go. He exhaled and sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Hannah ran over to the gun and pushed it into the corner with her foot. Miles, bleeding, said nothing. Only grinned evilly before passing out. Henry looked at his grandson. I knew everything. And I kept quiet. Because I was afraid the truth would destroy us all. But now that you've found each other, it's time. Time to finish what Margaret and Raymond started. His voice was weak but firm. And for the first time, Frank saw in his grandfather's eyes not only the strength of the Davenport family name, but the guilt he'd carried for decades. The silence in the room was filled with meaning. The walls no longer held secrets. They began to speak. Spring came to Seattle quietly, almost imperceptibly, without bright bursts, but with such soft constancy that one day you wake up and realize that winter is gone. The air was filled with the smell of the earth waking up after a long sleep and the freshness of blossoming trees. The Davenport mansion, for years a stone block of the past, now breathed differently. Its windows were open, its corridors filled with voices, and most importantly the greenhouse, the same one where Frank and Hannah had found the entrance to truth many months ago, was transformed beyond recognition. The tiles had been cleaned to a shine, the mosaics shone as they had in their youth, and the stained glass windows glowed all colors: pink at dawn, amber at noon, and blue at sunset. Along the walls were new vases, in which grew dozens of varieties of plants, from tulips to lavender. But the centerpiece of the greenhouse was a circular bed of white roses growing among the white stones. The roses that Margaret loved the most. Their petals were slowly opening to the spring sun. A sign nearby read, Garden of Hope. In memory of Margaret Davenport and Raymond Bennett. The foundation with the same name was officially opened the day before. The ceremony was attended by journalists, politicians, and representatives of public organizations. But most importantly, those who really needed this project came. Women who had lost their husbands in a foreign land, fathers trying to reunite with their children through bureaucratic barriers, families separated by fate, borders, or fear. The foundation offered legal aid, housing, and psychological support. The idea was simple: to connect those who had been separated, and to do so on behalf of a family that had itself once been torn apart by silence. Frank stood at the greenhouse window looking out over the garden. He was wearing a simple light-colored jacket, a sapphire ring on his finger, now not as a legacy but as a symbol. He felt that for the first time in years his life had found not just meaning but purpose. Hannah sat nearby, poring over the letters they were going to display in the foundation's museum. Lucas, covered in dirt from transplanting new shoots, ran between the vases with a watering can. He already knew the names of all the flowers and confidently called himself head gardener. Henry showed up late as usual with a cane but with a straight back. The illness was receding slowly, but he was holding on. In his hand he held an envelope, yellowed and sealed with a wax seal. He walked over to Frank and silently handed the letter over. On the back was a signature, to be opened when all is over and begun again. The letter was written in Margaret's hand. The ink had faded, but the words read clearly. My dear Frank, if you're reading this, you've found it. Not just Hannah, not just the ring, but the truth. I knew that someday someone in our family would be brave enough not to defend silence, but to turn it into action. You did what I failed to do, and I'm proud of you. Hannah is an extension of Raymond. Look at her and you will see not only the past but the future. Forgive us for our secrets. We thought we were protecting. But it turns out we were only delaying the moment when love could return. Make the Garden of Hope live longer than we do. Let it be a place where truth meets forgiveness. With love and everlasting faith, Margaret. Frank closed the letter and couldn't hold back the tears. Hannah walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. Lucas stopped at their feet, looked up and almost in a whisper said, "Dad." He didn't say it unscripted, not by request. Just because he felt that this was the place to put down roots. Frank sank down beside him, hugged the boy tightly, and at that moment the sun struck the stained glass window so that the white roses flashed with golden light. Perhaps only then did he realize, the rings are not jewelry. They were a bridge. A bridge spanning across decades, across lies, fear, death. Over impossibility. And when that bridge is spanned, you can walk across it. Again. And not alone. The spring breeze carried the smell of flowers and fresh earth to the greenhouse. Outside the mansion, life went on with its complexities and joys. But inside, in the warm heart of the house, the pulse of another family was now beating. A family that no one would ever again be able to tear apart with silence. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.